up, deals with things are like wrong sounding to us. They're backwards. They're incorrect. I had a math teacher in high school. He's one of my favorite teachers. And he would always erase anything that was incorrect on the board. And he would grunt, we can't have any lies on the board. And he would go back and it's like if he was showing you how to solve something and how you might get messed up, and it was like an example, he wouldn't leave it there for long. Or if someone was up there doing the problem and they didn't do it right, he would get rid of that right. He didn't want any lies on the board, anything wrong, anything that wasn't real math. And so I don't know if he would appreciate this series. But we're looking at things that just don't seem correct. They seem like lies are on Mr. Volley's blackboard, okay? And so today we're going to be looking at the fact that sometimes with God, less is greater than more. And it sounds backwards. And it doesn't mean always, but we're going to look at one specific passage where we see that less is greater than more. And we're Americans. We know that bigger is better, more equals more, and like no looking back. In fact, if you've been watching the Olympics, although we're the third largest country in the world and possibly the richest, we love to brag about how bad we destroy all these tiny little countries that we've never heard of. Like, yeah, we got more gold medals than you. Take that. You know, they're smaller than most of our cities. And we're like, yeah, we're amazing. So like, we love bigger, better, more, counting. More always equals more in America. But God says in this passage today that less is greater than more. Rochelle, my remote's not working, so I'll let you help me out. I apologize for that. Less is greater than more. And the passage we're going to look at today is in Mark chapter 12. If you brought a Bible or if you've got one on your phone, open up to Mark chapter 12. Mark's the second book in the New Testament. The first four are all about Jesus' life, his ministry, his teaching, his death and resurrection. And so he would go around talking to people, teaching people, healing people, doing miracles, hanging out with his guys, constantly pointing people towards God, pointing people towards God's kingdom, and sometimes just messing with our minds when he points something out that we're like, that seems backwards. I wouldn't have caught that. I wouldn't have noticed that. I wouldn't have added it up that way. And in this passage, we're going to see that with Jesus, sometimes less is actually greater than more. Okay, and this is a famous passage. This is one that you might have heard of or studied as a kid. It's about a little old lady, a widow actually, who gives a really tiny gift at church. And you might know it as the widow's mite. I actually brought some widow's mites. When we read this passage, a friend of mine named Dale, who goes to this church, he's sitting right there. He told me this morning how much he loves when people thank him from stage and call out attention. So everybody give it up for Dale. A few years ago, he gave me this. I keep it on my desk. These are, if you want to come see it afterwards, these are actual ancient tiny copper coins like the ones that we're going to read. And he actually made this and printed it out with this passage, which I just think is so cool. And he wrote me a little note to remind me that whatever we give to God, it's never too small. And that's what we're going to learn from this passage. So we're going to read this passage. And almost every week in our service, we pause and we talk about our giving and our offerings. And we actually usually take a moment and pray. And we'll do that actually before we end. And as we do pray, we want to just offer God our very selves and our heart. And as we think about giving and as we make donations to God in the different ways that we give, we want to just really give our heart with it and make that an act of worship. And today, instead of talking about that for like 2 minutes, we're going to talk about that for the whole message. If you're new or new-ish, no, we don't always talk about money, but we do sometimes talk about money. Jesus talked about money a lot. And we never want to guilt trip anybody, twist their arm, make them feel bad and make them give and pass the tray 19 times or anything like that. But we don't feel bad about inviting people to consider giving back to God. And that's what we're going to see from this passage. But he looks at this widow and her gift, and he's like, less is actually greater than more. Let's read in Mark chapter 12. We'll start in verse 41. And here's where we pick up the story. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put in and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury, okay? They're at the temple. This is a sacred place, kind of like we got a little offering box in the back. They hadn't figured out how to pass the buckets yet, so they had little boxes that people would give. And Mark's like, yeah, we were hanging out with Jesus, and he just like pulled up a chair and started staring at people while they were giving their gifts. How intimidating would that be? Now, I don't know. I picture him like grabbing a chair, pulling it up backwards, and just like sitting there in front of like, what do you got? I don't think it was quite like that. Maybe they were in the back and he was just noticing from afar. But it's interesting that he starts off this story by saying Jesus sat down and he just watched. Jesus watched the people as they put their offerings in. And I'm like, wow, I'm glad he's not here this morning to think about, noticing what I give or what I don't give or what I used to give or how much I give, because that's really, really intimidating that Jesus watched. And as intimidating as that sounds, I'm like, whew, glad we're not at the temple where Jesus was that day. It's interesting to think about the fact that God sees what you give. God knows everything before it happens. You can't fool him. You can fake me out. There used to be, if you ever went to church back in the day, we would usually give, there was no online giving, so you would give, and a lot of times you'd give in a little envelope. Remember the offering envelopes? And the joke was I just put one in my pocket so people thought I was going to make a big offering. I mean, I might not give it, or it might be empty, and I'm just throwing, I might do it 3 or 4 times so people notice. Because you can fool each other, you can fool me, but God knows if the offering envelope is empty or not, right? He sees and he knows what you give. And maybe that's equally intimidating as Jesus sitting in the temple watching people give, but he knows, he sees, he notices. He knows what you give. He knows how much you give. But more than that, he knows what you have. He knows how much you make. He knows what you give and what you don't give. He knows what you do with the part that you keep for yourself. He knows everything about your finances, probably more than your spouse does, right? I mean, it might sound intimidating, but that's not the point of the passage. In fact, in the story, we'll see Jesus doesn't scold anybody. He doesn't shake his finger at anybody. He's not begging people. He's not telling some guy to go back and give more, although he knows what he gave and how much he owns and everything else. But here's the thing. I have no idea what you give, and I'm so glad. Our church, we've got a finance team made up of volunteers that make sure everything's above reproach and double counted and double signed so that people aren't stealing and things like that, but none of us on staff, none of us pastors are part of that. So if you give $1 or $1 million, I wouldn't know it came from you, and I don't want to know. I don't want to be walking around being like, oh, this guy gives a lot, or this guy doesn't give enough, or whatever. Like, I don't want to have those thoughts. Jesus is holy. He can handle knowing it and still not judge people. That'd be hard for us. So I have no idea what you give. I don't know how often you give, and this whole talk, what we're going to see from Jesus and what I hope you hear from us as a church is this is not meant to be a guilt trip. We don't want to be, we're going to pull on your heartstrings and make everybody feel bad and start. Jesus doesn't guilt trip anybody. Jesus doesn't scold anybody. In this passage, we don't see him judge anybody, but he does praise someone. As the passage goes on, Jesus sat on opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Okay? I showed you the coins that I've got to remind me that sometimes we make a small offering and God notices anyways. He doesn't scold the lady and he doesn't scold the rich dudes. He's just like, they're giving, she's giving, and he doesn't scold anybody, he doesn't judge anybody. But he calls out this lady's gift as the greatest thing he's ever seen. He calls the guys over to make a big deal of it. It says many rich people threw in large amounts. And Jesus doesn't say anything. I mean, he's not saying they shouldn't, but like he thinks it's cool, but that just kind of happens. Mark doesn't say that Jesus notices or says anything. But then this poor widow, and here's the thing, widows are generally poor anyways. The fact that it says a poor widow, it's like a double whammy, like a double negative. She's not only a widow, which means she doesn't have, in that society, she wouldn't have a job, she wouldn't have someone to provide for her, but not only is she a widow, which is sad, she's also very poor. So this poor lady, honestly, should be the people that the church is giving money to. In the New Testament, it commands the church to take care of widows, right? And orphans. And so this is the lady that probably should be receiving from the mercy fund. Instead, she comes and she gives a tiny little gift because that's all she has to give. She makes this tiny, seemingly insignificant donation. And then look what happens. Look what Jesus says in verse 43. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had to live on." This is crazy. Jesus calls out this insignificant gift, this tiny little couple of cents, like, thanks a lot, lady. What are we going to do with that? We're going to support some missionaries for 6 seconds. Like, I don't know what they're going to do with her little gift, but Jesus is pumped about it. In fact, he calls over the guys to make sure that they see it, because like you and I, they wouldn't even notice how big of a deal it was. If someone goes and throws 2 cents over there, We're not going to write them, a thank you note and call the gang and everybody put them on our shoulders. But Jesus does that for this poor widow. He says nothing about these guys' huge gift. Those are the ones I'd be like, did you see that guy? That rich dude threw a giant check in there. Like, go everybody high five him. Nope. He just lets that guy keep going. Thank you very much. I don't need to call out your faith. But this lady, this sad old widow who makes almost a joke of a gift, he gets pumped about. He makes a big deal about it. He calls over the disciples to make sure that they don't miss it. And he says they gave more. She gave more than the other guys. I think the way it's phrased, it gives me the idea that he's saying she gave more than all of them put together. And I'm like, she didn't give more than any of them, let alone they're getting work done, Jesus. They're going to be doing ministry, right? They're going to start a youth group with that. They're going to send money across the seas and support people. Like, they could do a lot of ministry with what those guys gave. She didn't give more. I'm sure Judas is in the crowd and he's like, no, that's incorrect, Jesus. She did not give more, because he's always counting, right? Like, he's got his eye on the treasury even before Jesus did. But Jesus is like, notice what happened. She gave more. God's math doesn't add up the way we add things up. God doesn't think all the ways that we think. Jesus is teaching us that sometimes less is greater than more. She gave less. He says she gave more. And here's why. We said earlier, God sees what you give, but he's impressed by how you give. He's not impressed by how much you give. He's impressed with the heart behind the gift. He sees your faith. He notices obedience, and he knows your heart. And he sees this sad, poor widow make a teeny tiny gift. Everyone else would have laughed at her. And he pauses the service, calls over the leaders, and says, check out don't miss this. Look what just happened. Because it's not about how much she gave, it's how she gave. It's the heart and the faith behind it. All through the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, into Acts and the epistles, and everything that was taught from Jesus and by his followers to the early church, basically talks about sacrificial giving. The call for New Testament believers like you and I, people who believe in Jesus since Jesus came, the call for us is to be sacrificial givers. This is what he praises the lady for. She didn't give a lot, but she gave a lot for her. And he's like, that is a big deal. In the Old Testament, they were instructed to give a tithe. A tithe is basically giving your first and your best to God, right? If you're a rancher, you give them the first sheep. If you grow crops, you give them, in the Old Testament, you'll read over and over about the first fruits, because you're giving God your first and your best. Before you get more from your garden, you give the first ones to God. And then as they started to actually develop systems with money, you give, the first of your income to God. And it was set at 10%. That was kind of the command. So it was just like a requirement. It was like, here's the minimum to the temple. You give 10%. The New Testament is a little different, but similar. Through the New Testament, Jesus actually praises some guys for tithing. He's like, that's good, you should do that. The Apostle Paul writes letters with God's authority to the early church, and he says we should be percentage givers. Like, we should think about how much we want to give based on a percentage of what we make, which is great, because then if I start to make more money, my gift should follow it. I have the opportunity to give more when I make more. In the New Testament, they don't talk specifically about 10% as much as it was specifically commanded in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the things that are kind of instructed and commanded for believers are to be cheerful givers. It says we don't want to be compelled to give, guilt trip. That's why we always say we invite people to consider it. We're not trying to beat people up and make them feel bad about it, because God says, I want people to give because they want to, out of thankful, cheerful hearts. We're called to be sacrificial givers that say, well, this cost me something. Have you ever given something away and thought about what you don't get because of it? Like, well, I could have done this, but I did this instead. We blessed that family with such and such, and so we're not going to do this tonight, right? Or whatever it is. Or when you make your gift to church, you could probably look at how much you give over a course of time, maybe a year. If you get your giving statement back from the church and say, wow, what if I had taken that money and done something with it, went out for pizza, went on vacation, however much you gave. You can see the real monetary value of that. That means you're sacrificing a piece of what you have to God. And honestly, I think the New Testament talks about and teaches us to give beyond the minimum requirement. They already had like 10% set as, here's what you have to give. This is the requirement. Everybody gives 10%. That's like a minimum. You're just doing that because you have to. In the New Testament, he's like, God sent his one and only Son to forgive you all your sins. Give sacrificially, give cheerfully, give more than what you have to give. Just respond back to God. I wrote this down. It's not the size of the gift that counts. It's the size of the sacrifice that moves God's heart. So these guys give huge gifts, and I'm sure he's glad. I'm sure God will bless them for that. He's not saying they were wrong, but when she gave, although it was a small amount, the size of the sacrifice was huge. He's like, guys, check this out. It's not the size of the gift. It's the size of the sacrifice. In the New Testament, here's a few examples of sacrificial, beyond the minimum kind of instruction on giving. There's a guy that we know as the rich young ruler. And if you know the story, Jesus says to the guy, why don't you sell everything you own and give it all away? And the guy goes away sad because he'd rather have his stuff than a relationship with Jesus. Now, he's not telling all of us that we should sell everything, but that was what that guy needed to hear. What he's saying is it's more than just giving 10%. You know, this guy had a lot, and Jesus is like, you need to get over your stuff issue and follow me with all your heart. So he tells that guy to sell everything and follow him. Early Christians would sell their land, their properties, anything they owned, and then they would give it to the leaders of the church. They basically considered nothing their own. They would say, I sold this, and I got $10,000 for it. Here's the $10,000. Give it to the people who need it. God blessed me, and that's just the way they lived all through, you read about in the book of Acts. They shared everything. They considered nothing their own. Paul in the New Testament encourages Christians to give radically and to give sacrificially, way more than just like, well, I'm supposed to do this, and God said so, and there was the 10 Commandments and all that. He's like, no. Like, make it a thanksgiving offering, recognizing how good God is to you. Looking at the New Testament, the standard of giving appears to be higher than the Old Testament. The Old Testament was like, here's the minimum requirement. The New Testament invites us to think about percentage giving at a radical, sacrificial level. Now, for some people, a lot of people, 10%, to give away 10% of what you make, that's a lot of money. That adds up real fast. And in America, if you look at any stats on finances, most Americans spend more than they make. So like most Americans aren't making it on 100% of their income. And Jesus is like, well, you should try to live on 90%. That is radical. 10% is a huge deal. I don't want to say, oh, if anybody gives 10%, they should feel like they're just the scum of the earth. They're giving. No. But it's interesting to hear, like, sometimes I feel like we put a cap on ourselves because the Old Testament had that number of 10%, and we feel like that's the standard, that's what we do. And sometimes God would say, what if you gave more? What if 10% is not that big of a sacrifice? God's blessed you, God's provided for you, and all of a sudden, like, giving 10%, like, that's on, speed dial. That's just happened. I don't even think that's automatic. What if we gave sacrificial? That's what the New Testament seems to be inviting us to. 10% is a great starting point. It doesn't have to be your finish line. Now, again, I'm not trying to say everybody needs to give more and we're not leaving until you make a commitment to the church. That's not my point. But what I see in this passage is Jesus seeing the lady's faith, seeing the sacrifice, and that's what moves his heart. Jesus points out to his disciples that every little gift matters. Teeny, tiny, seeming to be a joke to Judas and some other people that were noticing. And he's like, no, that moves my heart. He calls the guys over. Guys, check this out. Don't miss this. This is awesome. This is what I do with my 16-year-old boys when I see like a really cool sports replay. I'm like, guys, check this out. I'm passing them my phone. Like, did you see this play? Like there was one yesterday where this guy like threw the ball out of his glove to the other guy who barehanded and they made a double play. It was awesome, right? Like, I want to show that. That's what I get excited about. Jesus gets excited about this lady giving 2 cents to the offering. He's like, guys, check this out. You don't want to miss this. I wrote this down. This is kind of weird, but I like it. The widow's mite was the widow's might. Right? You could look at her and say she gave nothing. Jesus looks at her and says she gave everything. Her strength, her faith was powerful, even though her gift was tiny. She totally understood that God was her provider. She's like, this is all I've got, and I'm still giving it to God because he's going to either take care of me or not. She wasn't trusting her money. She was trusting God anyways. And she couldn't wait to just give even the tiniest gift. You ever get a gift from a little kid? If you raise children and they want to give you something and it's insignificant. It's like a misspelled birthday card or something, right? Or like when they start to have just enough money, they might get you like a small piece of candy or something. And you loved it, right? Not because it's a great gift. It's cheap. It's, bad coloring or something like that. And you saved it for 6 years. Why? Because it's not how awesome the gift is. It's the heart behind the gift. It's the same with God. He sees this lady's faith. She's not trying to impress God. She's not trying to butter God up. She's not trying to get away with something or buy off her sin debt with God. She's just trying to give a gift to God because she loves him. She's like, this is all I got, but I'm going to give it with all my heart. And Jesus pauses the whole thing and makes sure. And then Mark, he tells Mark to write it down so you and I could get the message too. He wanted to teach his disciples live in the moment, and he wanted you and I and every Christ follower for eternity to get this story. She's famous. We don't know her name, but she's famous. And she understood God's promises. She probably knew this verse in Proverbs chapter 3. They had the Old Testament back then. And it says this, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the best part of everything you produce. Then he will fill your barns with grain, and your vats will overflow with good wine. She understood that promise. She's just taking God up on his promise. She's like, this is all I got, but I'm going to give it to you. You're either going to take care of me or not. I can't take care of myself. And Jesus is like, we got you. We noticed. God is moved by that. Cherry and I have seen this promise play out in our own life, where we've decided we're just going to try to be generous back to God. We're going to be givers, even some days it's harder than others. Some seasons of our life, money was so tight, but we didn't want to stop giving because we kind of made that commitment in our heart. And we've seen God just provide, sometimes miraculously, when we're like, I don't know how this is going to work. And he is just taking care of us. We thought we might lose a house. We never missed a payment. And it wasn't because of us. It was because God just kept moving and acting for us and helping. You guys probably have stories like this. When you go to lunch today or when you go home or whoever you came with, maybe you can share some stories where you've seen God come through on this promise in your life. Some days it feels like, hey, I've got what I need. I can take care of myself. And sometimes you feel like, I don't know how I'm going to take care of myself. And you see God come through on his promise when you're faithful. He says, first, honor the Lord with whatever you've got, even if it's 2 cents. And then you could trust God to provide for you. If you've seen that in your own life play out, you should share that story with whoever you came with today. Tell your own stories about how God's done that. I've seen that in my life so many times that we're like, okay, I don't want to trust myself, but I know I can trust God. So I don't know what this means exactly for you. I'm not going to try and tell you what you should do about it, but I'll just give you some prompts for you to consider, and this is between you and God. We're not looking for you to fill out a card or change your giving strategy. We just want to lead you in a time to think and consider and pray with God. But the first is, be generous back to God. And the key really is back. This widow understood that the 2 cents she got came from God. And the rich guys, whatever they had, that came from God too. And so it's really not that you're so amazing that you would give to God or give to God's work. It's that you have what God gave you anyways. The job you have, the education you have, the opportunities that have come your way, whatever you've got came from God. That's what we believe, that he gives it to you. You're just managing his resources as long as you're alive. However much he gives you to be in control of, if you want to give some back to God, the key is that you're being generous back to God. It's like if I take my kid out for lunch and I ask for one of his French fries, it's like I bought the whole basket of French fries, right? And this is what we do with God. Even if it's 2 cents that we give, when we give it with a sacrificial heart, God points it out to all the angels because he's moved by that. Second is, ask God what he would have you give. I dare you. I don't know if you've ever asked God, how much should I give? What do you want me to do? Maybe you asked God that a long time ago, and you've just kind of been on autopilot. You haven't thought about how much you give or how often you give or how much you should give. And I'm not trying to tell you how much. I really believe it's not the amount, it's the amount of sacrifice. That's what we see in this story. Sometimes less is greater than more. But have you ever prayed that prayer? God, what do you want me to do about this? How much do you want me to give? Do you want us to take another step in this? Do you want us to increase our amount? Do you want us to increase the sacrifice? And then just really spend time waiting and listening to see if he kind of nudges your heart or puts something on your heart. The question is, God, what are you calling me to give? The question is not, what does Erik say I should do? What does culture say I should do? You can just ask God directly. If you're married, pray with your spouse, right? But you can just say, God, what do you want me to do with your resources? Everything I've got came from you. I'm just managing it while I'm here. What do you want me to do with your resources? Do you want me to give more or more sacrificially? The next one is, be a sacrificial giver. If God nudges you with whatever he nudges you, and you're instantly thinking, oh boy, That's going to cost me. That means it's a sacrificial gift. It might be less than the person sitting next to you. It might be more than the person sitting next to you. God doesn't care how much you give versus how much they give. He sees your heart. So if God nudges you and it feels sacrificial, that's scary. I get that. That's uncomfortable. That's like, ooh, that's going to cost me. Anytime I eat fish, and I'll eat fish, but I don't understand why. It's expensive and it doesn't taste as good as steak. So I'm always like, I could be eating steak for how much I paid for this fish, right? Anybody else feel like that? Like when you give something up, like we only got so much, right? So if you're going to be a sacrificial giver, you're going to be aware of what you could do instead. That's okay. That's not to brag about, but the fact that you're aware of that and it feels scary and uncomfortable, lean into that conversation with God. I'm not asking you to be foolish. I'm not asking you to just sell your house and give all the proceeds. No, I'm just saying, would you be so bold to ask God, what would you have me give? And when it starts to feel scary and uncomfortable, that's because it's sacrificial. And God notices that sacrifice, that moved the heart of Jesus. Like we said earlier, God sees what you give, but he's impressed by how you give. You could be rich, you could be poor, and the amount of sacrifice could be either great or not. God doesn't need your money. He doesn't care about the dollar amount. He cares about your heart. And just like the rich young ruler, he's like, you got an issue with your stuff. You got to get over that if you want to really follow me. He wants your whole heart. He wants you to trust him. He wants you to honor him. He wants you to be completely surrendered. And for most of us who live in America, one of the hardest areas to surrender to God is our finances. We can give everything else to God in our heart and really mean it, but when it comes to how we manage the resources that he's given us, we sometimes just cling so tight because we're counting every penny and we're thinking about what we wish we had and we're paying off this debt, and that's totally normal. What we don't realize is how rich we are. You know, the passage said all these rich people came and gave their gifts. That's all of us. Like most of the poorest Americans are still in the top 1% of earners worldwide. We don't think about that because we're surrounded by rich people. You live next to rich people. And I don't know if they're rich or if they're just driving around a whole bunch of car payments. We don't really know. Sometimes we just think they got it all figured out. How do they afford all that? Well, they might not be. Most Americans are spending more than they make. But God's like, I want you to trust me. I want you to surrender every area. And it's hard for us Americans. But when we give him more of ourselves in every area of our heart, he fills it and fills us with more of himself. And you can share those stories at lunch today too. How God has met you, how God has grown you, how God has worked in your heart when you've actually let him into the hardest places to surrender. Sometimes us Americans, we're selfish, and that's the reason, we're not great givers. But a lot of times, I fear our hearts are more generous than our finances will let us be because we're maxed out. We're not even as selfish as we are, I wish I could give to that cause. I wish I could support that cause, that missionary, whatever it is. I wish I could be more generous. I wish I could give, but I can't. My bills are up to here. I'm too far maxed out. I'm in debt as it is. And our heart gets moved, but we can't write the check. We can't process the payment because we just know financially. And so if that's you, I just want you to know that our church would love to help you out if we can. We've offered classes to help people budget and manage their finances, not so that we can get more from you, but we want you to live a life that's free from the stress of being behind and the financial stress that might be the hardest stress you ever sweat. It breaks up marriages. It breaks down minds. It's hard. God doesn't want that for you, and neither do we. If we can help you find a class or something to work on budgeting and financing or your marriage because of it, we would love to come beside you in that because that'll bless your marriage, and eventually you'll get to a place where when you feel like you want to be generous, you can actually be generous. I think most Americans want to be more generous than they've put themselves in a position to be able to. But Jesus is honored by our sacrifice. Here's how it's worked out for me. At a young age, my family just taught me you're supposed to tithe. 10% goes to the church. I used to mow my grandpa's yard. He'd give me $10, and he would tell me one of those goes in the offering on Sunday. And he wasn't being funny. He was just letting me know, I'm your grandpa, I'm going to teach you how to do it. My parents were the same way. They always gave to the church. They taught me to give to the church. I was just raised thinking that was normal, which is really nice. Because if you wait till you make real money, and then you realize God wants you to give a percentage back, you're like, whoa, I just that's a lot of money, right? When it starts and it's like $1, it's like, okay, I can do that, and it grows as you go. So it might be hard for some of us to start. That's how it started for me. But I'll tell you what, tithing has helped me be a less greedy person and a more generous person. Because we just decided we're going to do it. My wife and I, as a couple, as a family, we just decided this is how we're going to honor God. We're going to give back to God a little bit of what he's given us. And I'll tell you what, I'm a very greedy, selfish person. I don't know if you are. You're probably a better person than me. I think we're all greedy in certain ways, and we just don't see it. We don't see it because we're normal. We're Americans. We're all greedy. We don't even think about it, right? Tithing is a discipline to help me be more generous instead of just hope I'll be generous. Because my hopes don't always come through. It's a practice that's helped me be less greedy and more generous. And then as my income has increased over the years, my giving's increased. But you know what else has increased? My desires. Well, now that I make more money, I can spend more money, and we can do that, and we can have that, right? This is the American way. The more we make, the more we want, the more we want, the more we spend. And even though we got more money, we feel like we're more broke than ever. And so this has been a good habit that I'm glad I started young, so that as my desires increase and our lifestyle can increase, and you get a raise and things like that, my giving actually increased with it because we decided we're going to be tithered. Shortly after we were married, my wife and I decided, what if 10% doesn't have to be a finish line? I just gave 10% since I was like 8 years old, right? And we thought about it, we prayed about it, we decided, God, we're going to up our percentage. We're going to give more than 10% because we can. And then within a month, we got pregnant and one of our cars died. And we're like, dang it, but we already promised God, right? You might have stories like this too. Like it was terrible timing. Like, thanks a lot, God. You're supposed to bless us more for giving more. Instead, we're like, now we're more broke. But we just kind of decided this is what we're going to do. And over all the years of our marriage, we've had some seasons where we were pretty strapped. Money was beyond tight. I was unemployed, and we just decided we're just going to give whatever. We're going to give a percentage of whatever we get, even when that percentage. Sometimes I felt like that widow. I was like, God, I don't have much to give, but this is my percentage. It's helped us stay generous, stay faithful, and be less greedy. And I am so glad we did, because we'll take God up on that promise that when you give generously to me, I will take care of you. And we've seen him come through so many times. If we had to trust in ourselves, we wouldn't have made it. But trusting in God, sometimes his math just doesn't add up to ours. Sometimes less is greater than more. Tithing has been a practical way for us to just know and remember that God's our provider. If you're a regular giver, when you make that gift, it's a great reminder that you're trusting in God more than yourself. That you're saying, okay, God, I'm going to live on this much of my income instead of this much of my income because I trust you more anyways. I want to be, banking on your promises more than my wisdom. And so it's just a practical, awesome reminder that God is your provider, and being generous back to him is the way you want to live. So if you're not disciplined in that, I want to invite you to consider that. I don't want you to feel bad. I don't want you to make a rash decision. I want you to pray about it. This is between you and God. This is not a church fundraising issue. This is a discipleship, a growing in God. I want to just invite you to consider that. Think about it with your spouse. Pray about it to God, and just see what he moves in your heart. And when you respond in faith, he notices. He calls the guys over even to look at this little tiny joke because it's a big deal to him. Because even with God, sometimes less is greater than more. I know that most of my spending will leave zero impact once I'm gone. Whatever I drove, whatever I ate, whatever vacations and pictures, that's all good. None of it's bad. But when I'm gone, it's gone with me. But whatever investment I make in Christ's kingdom lasts for eternity. This is why Jesus says, don't store up treasures on earth. Invest in eternal treasures where no one will steal and it'll never fade away. This is what he invites us to be a part of. And I believe that's the greatest thing to give towards. I want to just ask you to think and to pray about what God has given you and what he wants you to do with it. I don't want to tell you what to do, but I dare you to ask God what he would have for you. And I know that when we give back to him generously, he notices, he cares, and he blesses that obedience. Would you stand as we pray? And like I said, almost every week we try to just pray. Back in the day we passed the buckets. We kind of quit doing that. So if you want to give, you can give in the bucket. Most of us give online. You can do that Tuesday night or Sunday morning. It doesn't really matter. Some people have it regularly automated because I want to give this much and I don't want to forget. You can do that on our website if you want to, or you can give one time at a time. However you give. I'm glad I don't know how much. But God does, and he cares, and he sees your heart. And so I just want to pray as we even consider what God's given us, that we would just see him as our provider, and we would be worshipers that we would give every area of our heart, even our finances, to him, and we would just expect him to show up in ways that we can't, because his math doesn't always make sense to us, but it's better than ours. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you for Mission Bible Church. This is a room full of people who I know are so generous, way beyond any average American. And so, God, I pray that none of us would leave feeling condemned. I pray that none of us would feel guilty. God, in this passage, you watched people give. You didn't shake your finger or judge or scold anyone, but you did recognize genuine sacrifice. And so, God, we just want to say that we want to know you more. We want to follow you. We want to have big faith. We want to be close to you, and we want to just trust you with every area of our life. God, one of those areas is our finances. And so I pray that as your word and your Holy Spirit speaks to us, that you would just take away anything that I said that would be distracting or not from you, but Holy Spirit, and through your word and your wisdom, that you would speak to our hearts. And that if we'd be bold enough to just say, God, is there something that you want to move in my heart? And maybe you don't answer us today, but maybe this starts a season of us listening for you. God, we just want to invite you to speak to us. We want to be generous back to you. We want to be generous in general because you're like that with us. We want to recognize that you are our provider. Everything we've got comes from you. You've promised to take care of us. You've promised to give us what we need. And so, God, I pray that we'll just lean into that conversation with you. And I pray that we will continue to see you come through and point that out. Just like you pointed at that widow, we want to point at you. Every time you provide for us, every time you come through, God, I pray that we would share that story with others so they would see how good you are. I pray that school starts this week, that we would be lights in school as kids, as teachers, or just anywhere we go. Lights in our home, lights in our workplaces, that we would point people towards you. I thank you for your love and the way that changes us. I pray that we live cheerfully and give cheerfully. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you guys next week for the hot dog and ice cream party.